Thank you very much for what I said. It's funny, isn't it? Because I've been talking all the way through this retreat, but you don't usually get a round of applause. It makes you feel strangely nervous, like something extra special is needed from you. So I want to talk about, what the world needs now. I thought I'd start with this shrine, this remarkable shrine. And City earlier on was saying she thought it was like a sort of grotto. How I read it immediately was there's planet Earth, blue and green planet Earth. If you look carefully, you can actually see the continents. You can see Africa. Is that right? Yeah. London. Yeah, I can see London, yeah. Then if that's planet Earth, it felt to me that you've got the cosmos, you've got the universe spiralling round, and you've got the Buddha at the centre of the universe. And then the key to that is the mystery of death. That's what I thought the shrine meant, that you've got the world, what the world needs now. You've got the universe itself in a spiral around the central figure of the Buddha. And the key to the mystery of that is the mystery of death. That's what struck me when I saw the shrine. And the earth there reminded me of a very early memory I have when I was 7. I was asleep in my bedroom with one of my brothers. I've got 3 brothers. And for some reason my father just woke us up, the 2 of us up, as far as I remember, myself and my next oldest brother. Very, very unusual for my father to wake us up. And he came and woke me up and asked us to come and put our dressing gowns on. And I remember thinking, what's happening here? And we walked out at the middle of the night. It felt like the middle of the night. It was probably 10 o'clock or something. It felt all terribly exciting. And then we walked out onto the lawn, this little square lawn at the back of our garden. And my father pointed to the moon and said, "There's a man on there tonight." And I remember looking at the moon. You have to imagine myself and my brother in our little, rather uncomfortable dressing gowns, looking up at the moon and the clouds scudding across the moon. And my father just saying, "There's a man on there." And I remember just looking, almost trying to see him, that sort of moment of magic still stays with me. But then thinking back on it, somewhere in that I have a picture of me as a little boy, 7-year-old boy, looking up at the moon, and then this guy on the moon looking back to us. Because that's what you saw, wasn't it, at that time? Those of you who are old enough to remember, not so many of you, was the Earth, the Earth, the blue and green Earth, this beautiful planet. And those who went up to the moon, they wanted to look back at the Earth, didn't they? Beautiful Earth. And it does look... We've got rather too used to that picture now, haven't we, of the Earth from space. It's become a bit of a cliche. But in that moment when my father said, "There's a man on there tonight," and I, in my mind, had this man looking back at us all the way down to my tiny little garden in Henley in Arden. It's about an hour away from here in Warwickshire. This little crystalline place, this planet Earth, this fragile place, the beautiful blue and green planet. What does that world need now? In that moment, if you think back on that moment, the full poignancy of that touches you. A vast space and a small inhabited planet, on which there is, incredible suffering, incredible joy, incredible architecture, incredible poverty, the whole thing that we live on. So in a way, in this talk, I'd like us to sort of almost have that Earth that we're living on viewed from the moon in our mind a bit. Because, of course, the answer to the question of what the world needs now, the Buddhist answer to that, obviously, and you all know this by now, is that it needs the 3 jewels. It needs... Actually, it's probably better to call it the triple gem rather than the 3 jewels. In other words, a gem that's made of three gems, not three distinct things. And one of the things I want to do tonight is try and show you that it's one gem, a triple gem. The yellow jewel of the Buddha that you have on our kesa, the yellow jewel of the Buddha, the blue jewel of the Dharma, and the red jewel of the Sangha. That is really what Buddhism's saying, I think, is that that's what the world needs now, and that the Buddha would have said that 2,500 years ago, and from that perspective nothing really has changed. We've just got better at hurting each other in 2,500 years. But what the world needs now from a Buddhist point of view is those three jewels. So I want to try and, instead of just talking about the Dharma, because I don't think you quite can, I want to try to talk about this triple gem, a jewel made of three jewels. Yeah. And I want to try and see why it is, a little bit, I can't do very much tonight. Do you want to move, Matt? I can't quite see you, and it bothers me if I can't see anyone. I need to see the whites of your eyes. I mean that in a kind of nice way. Is there a cushion there? Yeah. So I want to try and show you how, give at least a bit of a start to how I think the three jewels is what the world needs now, and that isn't rhetoric. You know, that's genuine. Because I've come to think that the three jewels are what I want to call the value archetype, the archetype of value in life. But I'll hopefully try and show you that and say what I mean about that in the end. So the first jewel then, the Buddha jewel, the yellow jewel, the way to think about this, I think, is that what the world needs now is vision. Yeah, what the world needs now is vision, a vision, capital V. It needs a vision that's transcendental and yet fully human. A vision that's transcendental and yet fully human. A truly human vision. And yet it's quite difficult to sort of say what one means. It needs to be transcendental on one hand and truly human on another. Truly human and yet beyond gender, beyond class, beyond racial difference, beyond anything, something that, as it were, comes from the human, but that goes beyond the human, at least goes beyond ordinary human consciousness. Yeah, a transcendental vision that's fully human. Try and flesh out a little bit about what I mean by that, but it's easier to say what I don't mean. So I don't mean a supernatural vision. I don't think the world needs now a supernatural vision. In other words, a vision of some kind of God figure. And what you're seeing in the world now is the reoccurrence of religious wars, aren't you? In a way that seemed unthinkable even, 50 years ago. That you've now got the incredible violence of religious wars. So we definitely don't want a supernatural vision, a judging, powerful God in that sense. I think that actually humanity should have done with that by now. That that's a phase and a very valuable phase in human evolution of spirit. But I think we need to get out of that now. What's strange about modern life is that there's a huge movement back to it, back to a kind of medieval worldview, really. So we don't want a supernatural vision. It's too problematic. I mean, I say that with actually quite a lot of sympathy now for a supernatural vision. At the moment, I'm reading Paradise Lost. It's taken me all this time to get to it, and it's fabulous. I'm on day 4 of creation at the moment. I think I've got to birds being created. We've just done fish. It's really, really exciting. I thought I can really get into this. Jesus, lovely moment in Paradise Lost where Jesus gets off this incredible chariot. Jesus, this is before he's become incarnated, become Jesus and gone back to heaven to sit on the right hand of God. He then gets a huge golden compass and in the middle of chaos draws a vast circle and says, that is the universe that I'm going to create. Inside that will be Earth and the stars. And he draws a line through chaos. I thought it was fabulous. Anyway, But I don't think it'll work anymore. Makes sort of wonderful poetry, and I think the poetry of it has got a real meaning, but it's a highly metaphorical meaning, and of course it's not been read metaphorically. So I tend to think that we should grow out of that now. But at the same time, it can't be a secular vision. It can't be a merely human vision. What's one of the things that's strange is there seems to be a rise of the kind of dogmatic secularism. The secular world is suddenly trying to ape religion in starting to make kind of pronouncements in an almost religious way, but in the secular way. It's really quite odd. It's sort of part of religious wars. It's a rise of a vehement and at times dogmatic secularism. And with that, a kind of literalism, a scientism, a dogmatic secularism, which I find almost as bad as a dogmatic religion, almost worse sometimes. In some ways it's uglier. So we need a genuine vision, a transcendent yet fully human vision that's not supernatural and is not secular. We also need a vision that's actually genuine, not a pious hope. I think one can easily get into pious hopefulness. As the song continues, what the world needs now is love, 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 or whatever it is. If you're not careful, you just get into pious hopefulness, into kind of platitudes of what the world needs now is love. But even though that's true, it's sort of just, pious hopefulness, where you imagine a heaven on earth. In an unrealistic, not really aware of the real issues kind of way, a kind of pious hopefulness. I think even Buddhists at times are given to pious hopefulness, hoping for a sort of golden time or something. I think it's a danger, really. So we want a genuine vision that's not secular and not divine, but a vision that encompasses and transcends both. The division between secular and divine is not a Buddhist division. It comes out of the Reformation. It's sort of alien to the spirit of Buddhism. But really, if we want to use that language, we need a vision that combines and transcends both. Yeah. Of course, the other thing about that that's been striking me is that I don't know how to put. This isn't really my field, but that democracy isn't a vision, or even democracy, valuable and wonderful though it is and has been, it's extremely fragile. It hasn't got a vision, really. It just sort of wants to say, well, let's. It's sort of like an English thing. Let's all just play fair, with that accent. Let's just all play fair. There's all good sort of sportsmanship. There's everything to be said for democracy. But what I'm feeling more and more struck by is how fragile it is, because it hasn't got an animating, passionate vision that is behind it. So it's extremely weak against the rise of new religious bigotries and new religious extremism. It's extremely weak in that way because it hasn't got a vision of its own. It's got its own procedures and so on, and it's been an incredible boon to us. But it hasn't actually got a vision. So it's very easy to break it. It's very, very weak, I think, democracy. And the other thing that's been striking me about democracy is that particularly our modern and consumer materialist culture is that it really depends on money. If you haven't got money, it's a fat lot of good it is to you. I live in the East End, which when I moved in, however, 30 years ago, was very, very poor area, very rough area. You'd be even nervous to go out at the streets at night. Now it's sort of trendy cafe area, which, I like cafes, don't get me wrong. In fact, I spend far too much time in them, but that's another matter. You can say, I want a decaf, black, flat white, but can I have coconut milk, not almond milk, and skinny coconut, and it could be, you know what it's like. I'm the only person without a tattoo on one hand and a dog under the other. And frankly, a tattoo at my age wouldn't suit me. But what's striking is if you haven't got money, everything closes to you. Literally everything closes to you. You know, all the gorgeous shops and the gorgeous things, you can't have any of them. If you haven't got money, our culture doesn't really offer you very much at all. It offers you, you know, some things, but not very much at all. And it's not surprising then that if someone comes along with a burning religious vision, and a vision for changing the world, and a vision of morality, and a vision of getting back your own life, it's not at all surprising that that's so seductive. Yeah? So democracy isn't a vision, it's very weak. And it might show up to be weaker and weaker quite quickly. Already you're seeing signs of the weakness of democracy. You know, in the UK we've been asked to make a decision which none of us are really qualified to make. At least I don't think we are. I'm certainly not. I like to think that I can think a few things, but no way was I qualified to try and make that decision. That's a real weakening of what we're doing. Yeah? So democracy has no vision. So we need, don't we, this transcendental vision that's universal, that's transcultural, that comes from the human, isn't imposed upon it. Religious vision is usually imposed upon the individual by God, or by God, mostly by God. Not imposed upon us. And we need a vision that somehow transcends death. The great question in our life is that it's shadowed by death. Right from the start, our days are shadowed by death. It's death that makes life such a problem. I mean, we are in the biggest possible koan you could possibly have. The one thing that you definitely don't want to happen to you will happen to you, and you have no idea when. Yeah? We couldn't be in a more dangerous position. Of all the things that could happen, there's one thing that we absolutely do not want to happen, and we've no idea when it will happen. Yeah? That casts a shadow across all of human endeavour. It's that asks this question. I think it's that, for me, that I really like the skull being lit, that it begs a huge question. My first experience of that question that I remember was when I was, again, probably about the same age as my father took me out to look at the moon. My grandmother died. I was very close to my grandmother. She's quite an eccentric old lady. She was 91 when she died, and she'd worn black ever since her husband died 40 years before. And she kept large, my family still have got it, a coach firm, and she'd get these large Alsatian dogs. So she'd sit in her chair in black, very regally, with these huge dogs by her, like on some throne. And I'd run round, every morning I'd run round to see her. She was very indulgent of me. She said that I had character, and that therefore... because my mother was worried about me, and she said, no, he's got character. I think actually it just came from the fact that I didn't colour over the lines. She seemed to be particularly impressed when I did the colouring a goose in yellow, and I didn't go over the lines, and she thought that, this is a genius we've got on our hands. I think her concept of genius was fairly limited. Anyway, she died when I was about 8, I think. And very unusually, my mother and father took my brother and I, Johnny, my next brother, up to go and look at the body on the bed. She was in coffin on the bed. And what I remember is my father or my mother saying, but somebody said, she's gone to a better place. And I remember thinking, I have seen no evidence of that. I mean, I probably was a bit younger, I might have been 6 or 7, but I remember thinking, really? I think they're doing it. When you're a child that age, you think, I know what they're up to, these adults. They're hoodwinking me again. And then I think my mother said she's asleep, and I thought she's definitely not asleep. I'd often seen my grandmother asleep because I used to wake her up and start talking to her because I had character. And I thought, I've seen her asleep. No way is she asleep. She is not asleep. But what I remember from that experience is that this is a massive issue here on this bed. This is a universe, I didn't have those kind of words, but a universal, massive, humongous, whopping great, fabulously big issue on this bed. And my parents don't know anything about it. I was really I thought, they don't know what's happened. And I didn't know what happened. I don't remember being upset. I just remember the confrontation of it, the confrontation of death. Thinking, right, then this is people know, they don't know what happened. Yeah. So, what we need somehow, impossible though it sounds, is a vision that transcends death, makes sense of death. I don't mean literally. I don't mean that you literally don't die. The Buddha died, although his death isn't a death in any way we understand it. We don't know what happens when you die. You don't know, I don't know, we don't know. We've got all kinds of beliefs about it, which we disguise as facts in our mind. We call them facts, just as 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you would have had a belief in God and call that a fact as well. We believe that death is the end, and we call that a fact, where it's actually a belief, like a belief in God. It's just based on lack of evidence. Yeah? You don't know what consciousness is now, so absolutely no way do you know what happens to it when you die. But somehow you need a vision that makes sense of that, transcends that. According to tradition, the Buddha's parinirvana, it doesn't mean death, that we translate as his death, but it really means enlightenment without remainder. He was enlightened under the Bodhi tree, and then when he died, he was enlightened, but without the remainder, by which they mean without a body anymore. It's an utter mystery about what the Buddha's parinirvana. And for a genuine vision, it needs to be centered on that mystery. Otherwise, it's merely a human vision. It basically is a secular vision, that what you can do in this life is be a bit happier, a bit more mindful, a bit nicer to your neighbours, but basically ends in death just the same. Yeah. For a vision to be a vision, it needs to tackle that central question, and it needs to somehow transcend it. I won't say how, because I haven't got long enough time, but that's what we need. That's what the world needs now, is an animating vision that you can really get behind, that you can really believe, that doesn't require you to do some weird bit of funny theology or weird thinking, that you have an instinct for even. Yeah? That's what the world needs now. A vision, yeah? A vision for what we could be. And the exemplar, of course, in Buddhism for that vision is the Buddha himself. He represents enlightened humanity. He is these two great matters coming together, enlightenment and humanity, time and timelessness, history and universality. He represents the coming together of opposites, the union of history and timelessness. He is the exemplar of that vision. He is both human, but not merely human. He's both divine, but not literally divine. Yeah. He transcends that distinction between the secular and the divine. I think that the Buddha is the vision that human beings need. I really do. I don't think I'm just being rhetorical, because I think that God is dead. I think Nietzsche, all that time ago, was just saying how it was, and all of his predictions about what would happen on the death of God pretty much come true, fearfully come true. He said there'd be a new kind of nihilism. So God is dead, but the secular life is just not enough. It's not big enough for us. I think I feel more and more strongly that secular life is a kind of lie, a kind of evasion. When you fall in love with someone, it doesn't feel like a secular experience. The first time you touch your boyfriend or girlfriend's hand when you're 15 doesn't feel like a secular experience. Your dreams don't feel like secular experiences. Humanity is too great to be secular in that small, reduced, scientist, pseudo-rational kind of way. It's really not enough for us. a while ago I went to a secular funeral, but not carry on too much, otherwise I won't get to my other points, but I went to a secular funeral and I was really struck by it. You know, it was in the Ashmolean in Oxford. Everybody there was a professor apart from me and Ollie. I don't think you're not a professor. Ollie and I went together. And I really felt like halfway through this funeral, I felt like saying, "Excuse me, you're not going to do it like this, are you? You're not seriously going to do it like this." The friend of mine, he was in his coffin, which nobody referred to. Everybody got up to the front and gave little talks. His body was behind them. You'd think it was just a sort of mantelpiece. I really was quite appalled. These are highly intelligent, extremely cultured men and women, sort of the intellectual elite, and they had nothing to say, it seemed to me, about this issue, about death. Secularism just had nothing to say. It was like it was happening on Radio 2. I was even introduced like that, and Maitreyabandhu from the London Buddhist Centre is going to come and say a few words. I felt saying, "You're not going to do it like that, are you?" I thought it was appalling. Anyway, there we go. Calm down. So, first of all, I'm saying that what we need is a vision, a transcendent vision, that transcends the secular and the divine, that goes beyond that polarity. And I'm saying the exemplar of that is the Buddha. That's what you find in the Buddha, is something that transcends secular and the divine. But I also want to say what I thought the opposite of that is, just to heat things up a bit more. So the opposite of having a vision, I think, is cynical rationalism. Yeah? Cynical rationalism. Very, very common nowadays, cynical rationalism. So cynicism is really a fear of emotions. The reasons why people are cynical is because they're frightened of emotion, especially positive emotion. Often to do with the fact that their experience of positive emotion has let them down. So they want to diss it. They want to destroy it. Cynicism is a kind of destruction of a vision. You want to say, "Oh, that's like so then." You want to do that cool posturing, "Oh, I can't believe you're talking in these visionary terms. Get a life, man up," all those sort of dreadful, cynical thoughts. So yes, cynicism is really a fear of emotion, especially a fear of positive emotion. And by rationalism, I don't mean to criticize the reason. Buddhism, if it's genuinely Buddhism, should be encouraging you to think deeper, should be encouraging you to think more clearly. There should be no suggestion that Buddhism is trying to dampen down your thinking. It wants you to think clearly, not confusedly, but it encourages thinking, encourages reason. By rationalism, I mean an irrational unwillingness to forego reason. That's what I mean by it. An irrational unwillingness to forego reason. It would be a bit like standing in front of a beautiful painting or a beautiful sunset and having to give a rational set of reasons about why you think it's good. It's fully irrational. When people behave like that, they're behaving irrationally. You don't listen to music in that spirit. You cannot be touched by it if you listen to it in that spirit. What rationalism does is it turns reason into religion. And that's what you're getting in this rise of bigoted secularism. It's using reason irrationally. Yeah? So that's the first thing I think we need. We need a vision, and the opposite of that vision is cynical rationalism. The second thing we need, the second jewel, but I want to talk about it in a slightly different way. The second thing the world needs now, what the world needs now, is a path, a practical path towards that vision. Yeah? A doable, practical path towards that vision. For that vision to have any value, there essentially needs to be, a pragmatic path towards it. Otherwise, it's no good to anyone. It's no good having a vision, that's sort of what I mean by pious hopefulness. It's no good having a vision of heaven if you can never get there. It's just a fantasy, yeah? So you need a practical path towards that vision. And that path needs to make sense. It needs to be coherent. It needs to be self-coherent. It needs to have stages on that path. It needs to be a coherent path of growth. And it needs to take in the whole of ourselves. It needs to be a path that we can include the whole of ourselves, by which I mean your reason, your deepening your reason, intensifying your emotions, and clarifying your intuitions. But I also was thinking that it needs to have a kind of erotic component, and I mean that in the old-fashioned sense of eros, that you're turned on, that you're lit up by the vision. It needs to be a vision that can excite us in the proper sense. Can't think of the word I'm trying to get. When you're erotically attracted to something, everything's moving in that direction. I don't need to explain all this. Surely you've been there by now. Your thoughts, your feelings, your body, that's the word. It's arousal, isn't it? I wanted to use eros in the sense of arousal, being aroused by something, which is a state of more alive, being aroused by something. And we've ended up just putting that down to sex and so on. But actually, a deep communication can arouse something in you. A deep meditation can arouse something in you. A sense of community here that we're so much enjoying now arouses something in you. You're trying to get the whole of you moving, not just your reason, not just the goody two-shoes bit of you, as it were. The whole thing needs to move, yeah? It needs to be, as it were, a path of eros. And it needs to start as a human path. It needs to start from right where you're standing in this human world, in this dirty, grimy human world, and it needs to lead beyond the human world. Actually, a path is a far too nice a word. At first, it's more like a hacked track. It's more like a hacked path in the undergrowth. When I first came to the Dharma, to Buddhism, I was frankly a mess, as David Mitra will tell you all, if you ask him about it. I was completely a mess. And I definitely had the sense of, yes, this is the vision. I knew I was a Buddhist immediately. And I knew it would be difficult for me. And I knew it would be difficult for me because I'd come to Buddhism in just such a mess. I was depressed and anxious. I was a show-off. I was self-dramatizing. I came in a mess. So that path had to be sort of fought for at first. And I kept on just falling into the brambles and then crying and so forth, that sort of thing. So at first it's a hacked path. But it needs to become eventually a rainbow path to Valhalla. So in Wagner's tetralogy, in the first opera, whatever it is, Rheingold, is it? Rheingold, yeah, that's Rheingold. At the end, they walk over this rainbow path to the Temple of the Gods, Valhalla, to this rather consciously pompous, the music is intentionally pompous, I think. It's a sort of very subtle Mickey take, that music, but intentionally pompous music. Sort of vainglorious music is probably a better word. But taking away all that, we need eventually to find this path that leads us to reality. And that path is a rainbow path. It's a path of more and more subtlety, more and more mystery, less and less to do with the gritty, nitty bits of being human, and more to do with something that's very, very difficult to talk about. Yeah? I was thinking this in terms of, recently I discovered... crikey, look at the time. That's better. Recently I rediscovered a photograph of me when I was ordained. I was ordained just after my 29th, like the day or two after my 29th birthday. So quite recently. Yeah, quite recently. And I had this photograph of me of the day of my public ordination. And I look beatific. It's the first time I'm wearing my kesa, I'm wearing my robes, I look beatific. And what struck me about that photograph, finding it now at the age of 55, is that So often when we talk about a vision, we think of moving towards a vision. But often a vision is to do with keeping faith with the vision you had as a young man or a young woman. Often vision is to do with keeping faith with something that you even touched as a child. I remember even as a child in Henley and Arden thinking, this cannot be right. Something is wrong with the whole thing. I remember thinking that everybody was lying. That was my strong... People were pretending that they knew stuff, pretending that they were in communication with each other. I thought it was a terrible pretense. I don't know where I got it from. But I wanted to shake it. I think sometimes we get into destructive behaviour because something deep within us is responding to a vision. We're saying, no, but this can't be it. And the only way I could get to my vision is to smash this. So very often a vision is to do with keeping faith with your past, not living up to a future, but keeping faith for me with that 29-year-old who just got ordained and saw the future from that point of view. Could I bear to meet myself now? Could I go back then in time? How would I feel about myself now? Vision is as much to do with that. It's as much to do with going back to yourself as an 8-year-old lying on the lawn looking at the stars, or being holding my father's hand looking at the moon. That's what you're trying to keep faith with. That sense of mystery, of human value, of non-cynicism, of wonder. That's what we're trying to keep faith with. What Buddhism offers you is an actual practical path to go towards that vision, to live up to that vision. And it needs to be a path of commitment. The Buddhist metaphor for this is that if you want to get water from a well, you go to one well and you drop your bucket all the way down to the bottom. It's no use going to lots of wells and dropping your bucket down halfway. In contemporary life, it's very, very easy to go to lots of wells and drop your bucket down halfway. You can do, the 12-step fellowship, then you can do, some sort of, go to a Theravada group, then you could go to a humanist group, then you can go to psychotherapy and then a Jungian thing. And if you're not careful, if we're not careful, we never say, here's the path I'm treading. Here's the well where I'm going to put my bucket all the way down. Modern life makes that seem like a limitation. But actually you won't get anywhere. You won't get any water if you don't put your bucket all the way to the bottom. So it doesn't need to be this path. It doesn't need to be with the Triratna Buddhist order and community. That's up to you. But you do need to commit yourself to something. If you don't commit to this path, you need to commit to something. Otherwise you won't get any water. Yeah? So the exemplar of this, the exemplar of this path, of course, is the teachings of the Buddha, what we call the Dharma. So I'm trying to say there's a kind of archetypal value in the path, capital P, and the exemplar of that path is the teachings of the Buddha. You could say, I would say that, but yes, I will say that, yeah. So the opposite to a path, the opposite to this path, is what I've called egotistic lack of receptivity. Yeah? Egotistic lack of receptivity. That's a really nice way of putting it. The Buddhist way of putting it would be conceit or pride. Yeah. Now it's tricky this because receptivity is, I won't say dangerous. That's too strong a word. Although not necessarily. It's a risk being receptive to people because you might be receptive to the wrong person. You might be receptive in the wrong way. You can't get that right necessarily. You can get it wrong. But if you're not receptive, you will not learn. And your life won't go anywhere. My life won't go anywhere. I think one of the things I could say for myself is I have been receptive to my friends. I remember many, many years ago, David Mitchell really, really challenging me once in a way that shocked me so much. And I remember thinking, yes, but that's true. What he's saying is true. I didn't defend against it. I didn't say, yeah, but what, but yeah, but you, yeah, but... I remember thinking, oh crumbs, that's true. So it's difficult to be receptive, and there are problems about being receptive, and one has to learn how to do it well and not be foolish, not renounce your individuality, not be gullible. Actually, it's often cynical people that are also gullible in my experience. They seem to go together, cynical and then gullible. Yes, but if without being receptive, there's no growth. And of course, conceit or pride, from the Buddhist point of view, is our basic kind of issue. That we think we know, we think we can do it ourselves, we don't think we need to ask for help, we're as good as anybody else, thanks very much, and so on. Yeah, modern life really encourages that egotistic unreceptivity. It's even seen to be a good thing, as if that makes you an individual and a kind of cowboy or cowgirl in the world, tough, stupid really, is another way of putting it. Less Latinate, perhaps. So that's my second thing I think the world needs now. It needs a path, a genuine path that starts right at your feet and ends on the rainbow path to Valhalla, as it were, very metaphorically. The opposite to that, I've suggested, is egotistic lack of receptivity, and the exemplar of the path is the Buddha's teachings. And then thirdly, we need a community of disciples. We need a community of disciples. I think this may be in many ways the most important thing we need. Actually, you can't really divide them because there's no community of disciples without a Dharma, and there's no Dharma without a Buddha. Part of what I'm trying to do in this talk is show that they are one gem. There's only one thing the world needs now, it's a triple gem. So we need a community of disciples based on a shared vision and a shared path. There needs to be that shared vision, not a secular limitation of ourselves, which is too small for us, and not a dangerous supernatural, but a shared vision that encourages you to think, that encourages you to feel, and encourages you to clarify your intuitions. And there needs to be a shared path, a shared understanding of that path, a shared sense of stages of that path. A shared path that can really help us make progress. We need people on that path who can encourage us, who can remind us, who can challenge us, sometimes even strongly challenge us. That's what we're trying to develop here. We're not trying to develop just a sort of a good group where we're all nice to each other, valuable though that is. And if the world was like that, that would be a great place to start. We're trying to create a sangha, a community of disciples with a shared vision and a shared path, who have agreed that they can relate to each other based on that shared vision and that shared path. So that David Mitra, when I was 26, could challenge me very strongly, and we'd agreed, as it were, implicitly, that that's what we were trying to do. Yeah, that's what we were trying to do. We need to be like mountain climbers roped together, where one person goes ahead for a bit and then they guide you up a bit. I mean, already I think that's been happening in the groups. Sometimes I've been hearing from the groups, and it sounds like it's becoming like mountain climbers roped together. One goes in front and then helps the other up and say, oh, no, it's not like that. Somebody says, oh, the communication exercise was like that. And someone says, oh, no, my experience was like this, drawing everybody else up a bit. Somebody else says something, you draw somebody else up more, yeah. So that's what we're trying to be, is like mountain climbers roped together, allowing for this particular kind of intensity of communication between us, a willingness to be truthful with each other without loss of kindness. You can't be truthful without being kind. And at the heart of this community of disciples, you need cores of strong friendships, yeah? Particularly within the sexes. You need, it's very striking from last night, the strong friendships existing between women. You also need strong friendships existing between men. Otherwise, men and women get into trouble with each other because they look for things from each other that really they should be looking from their friends. So at the heart of that community of disciples are close same-gender friends who are committed to the path and committed to the vision. Yeah. And on that path, of course, we need exemplars. I was saying that the Buddha is the exemplar of vision, the Dharma is the exemplar of the path. in terms of the community of disciples, the exemplars are those people you look up to, by which I mean people that you can actually meet and interact with. For there to be a genuine Sangha, there needs to be people who you feel are generally speaking, at least generally speaking, not all the time, it's never all the time, are a bit higher up the mountain and are helping you up on the rope. You might go past them later on, and you might go past them sometimes, but you need, if you're to make progress, to have a sense that this spiritual life, this Dharma life, this path we're on, isn't a fantasy, it's not a pious hope. It's not something that happened 2,500 years ago and sounds lovely. It's something that you can actually see and feel around you as a living reality. Otherwise, for me, it just feels like, well, it sounds lovely, but it might just not be true. It might just be a fantasy. So you need friends that you can look up to, but not only that, but the example of friendships that you can look up to. Friendships between people that you see, that you think, I want friendships like that. A bit like Donna Utah's talk. She was talking about just seeing friendship and thinking, I want friendship like that. In a way, I think this is what we need most, this community of disciples. Sometimes I spend a lot of time teaching meditation, and sometimes I think, why am I spending so long talking about meditation? Mostly what people need is a community of disciples. They need to be a part of a community so their blind spots can be seen by other people. All of us inevitably have blind spots. It's part of being human. Without friendship, you'll never be able to see around those. You'll just live within the limits of your blind spot. Even if that's a spiritual blind spot. It can happen quite easily in spiritual life, especially if you start to get a bit separate and isolated. You start to think about your practice and even have ideas about how far you've got with that. But unless it's in relationship with friends who will challenge you and test you, it really is untested. And it very often is just merely you expressing the limitations of your blind spot. So the opposite to a community of disciples and the exemplars along that path is privileged individualism. Privileged individualism. In my notes I put etc. Oh dear. Anyway, privileged individualism, etc. So by individualism I mean the idea that we have that we are the owners of our life, that our life is ours and that what we need is choice and so on, and I do what's good for me, as if we weren't reliant on everybody else, as if we weren't reliant on the fact that Sanghadasa the other day kicked the boiler, so that meant we had hot water because the wood chips had got stuck in the tube. Actually, as soon as I stood in the shower, and I didn't have a shower because it was cold water, but actually I'm reliant on him to kick the boiler the next morning so I could then have a shower and thus appear before you. So immaculately showered. But individualism is this very deep assumption that we are individuals. Actually, often we're just pretending to be. We're pretending to be individuals. It's probably the greatest threat to the Dharma in the West is individualism. And there's even such a thing as spiritual individualism, unfortunately. And you can only be individualistic when you're privileged. If you don't have money, if you're living like many order members in our order have done in a terribly impoverished world in India, no way can they do individualism because they haven't got any basis for that. If they get ill and their family's not there, they will die. There's no chance of individualism. It's a luxury they can't afford. Individualism is a modern luxury. It's a luxury goods, yeah? And it sort of destroys this community of disciples. And it's extremely prevalent in the modern West. So those are my three things. I think the world needs a vision that transcends the secular and the divine. It needs a path, a genuine path, a practical path towards that vision that's real, not a fantasy. It needs a community of disciples who help you along that path, who encourage you, remind you, challenge you, bring you back onto it. A community of disciples that help you along that path, without which no progress can be made. So those are the things, that's what I think the world needs now. This triple gem, this Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. This vision, this path, and this community of disciples. And this, it seems to me, is a value archetype. It's the value archetype. It's the foundation of all real values. I could talk too long about this, but I'll just briefly give you an example of that. So, relatively recently, I've got a little bit involved in the poetry world, which is tiny. It's like a little tiny little. There's only 3 people who read poetry, and I'm one of them. So, and the other 2 don't agree. But I've got a bit involved in the poetry world, and it's very interesting when it's quite late in my life to discover that. But as soon as you enter that world, what you find is a sort of echo of those 3 values, an echo of that value archetype. So you have the great exemplars, the vision. You have, I'm reading Milton at the moment, but you've got Coleridge and Wordsworth and Keats, and you've got someone like more modern poets like Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, Marianne Moore. They're people who, at least to some extent, exemplify where poetry is trying to get. And even you've got something beyond that, this word poetry, which means something that nobody's ever been able to do, but that everybody's trying to do, a bit like a transcendental figure. Then you've got all of those teachings, techniques, workshops, that try to help you move towards that vision. You've got Arvon writing courses, you've got work writing groups, you've got literary magazines, etc. And then you've got a community of people trying to do that. Yeah? I think that is every area of life that you look in, where you experience value, you'll discover this reflection of the triple gem. There'll be a vision, even if it's something like swimming, there'll be a vision, there'll be all those teachings and practices and approaches that lead you to that vision, and there'll be a community of people trying to tread that path. The Buddhist path is that human value, that value archetype, taken to the absolute greatest pitch, taken to its deepest, rarest pitch. It's that value archetype that we find in every sphere of life, a vision, a path, a community. It's that taken to the highest pitch of perfection. If we can start to live that path, that great path, towards that great vision, and if we can start to create a community of disciples that we're constantly bringing more and more people in, not because we're trying to, bump up the numbers or anything, not because we're trying to be a group in that way, but because people really feel that the only way to help the world is to help the world together on the basis of a shared vision, practicing a shared path with a shared language and a shared symbolic world. That's what I believe the world really needs now. It needs a new kind of community that goes beyond gender, goes beyond race, goes beyond all these terrible divisions that are breaking the world up. It's like a great God at the moment shaking the world to break it up along gender lines, along ethnic lines, along racial lines, along economic lines. We need a transcendental vision that's beyond the secular and the mundane, that can unify humanity, can unify men and women as friends, and therefore, together, change the world. Thank you.